In this video, we're just making tables given a particular equation. And so the very first equation we're given here is y equals the absolute value of x. Now, remember what the absolute value does. Whenever you see those two vertical bars around x, that does mean absolute value. And absolute value technically means the distance from that number from 0 on a number line. Okay, well, the upshot of that, though, is that it just makes whatever's inside of it positive. So a positive number stays positive, a negative number becomes positive. That's what absolute value does. Then, once we know that, filling in the table is much easier. Basically, what we're going to do to fill in our table is we're going to take each of these individual x values, and we will then just plug them in for x in that equation. Which means that for this first one, we are doing the absolute value of -5. And remember, the absolute value takes whatever it was and it makes it positive. So the absolute value of -5 then is +5. And that's all I have to do for that is I just need to say, oh, well, it becomes +5. And so if I do the same with -4, the absolute value of -4 is 4. And you can see very quickly how a lot of these are going to roll out. Now, then we hit 0. The absolute value of 0 will actually still be 0. And then we get into the positives. The absolute value of 1. Well, remember that if it's already positive, it stays positive. So the absolute value of 1 is 1. And so the absolute value of 2 would be 2, and so on. And then this table would be complete. That's all you need to do for filling in that table. Later on, we'll see that once we have a table made, how we then will start translating that into our graphs to make sure that we see that very important connection between equations, tables, and graphs, because they all are always working together. Let's go ahead and practice this with another equation. This time we're doing y equals x squared. And once again, we're going to be taking whatever our x value is, and I'm going to be starting with -5 here, and we're going to plug that in for x. Just be careful with this one, because I've often seen people who will write this as -5 squared, like that. But that actually is not quite right, because you notice that the whole x is being squared in our equation up here. Well, right now, with the way it's written, technically we're only squaring the 5, not the negative. So you'd actually need to put parentheses around that -5 when you put it in there. And that's going to make a big difference. And if you want to try to break out your calculators to do this problem, because of that little detail with the parentheses, your calculator might actually tell you the wrong answer. Let's be smarter than our calculator here. -5 squared. Remember that squaring something means to multiply it by itself. So -5 squared means I'm going to be doing -5 times itself. So -5 times -5. What's a negative times a negative? It's positive, yeah. And what's 5 times 5? It's 25. And so it is a positive 25. Oftentimes I will see students enter this in their calculator, and their calculator will tell them that it's -25 because of that whole parentheses thing, and they believe it. Remember, you got to be smarter than your calculator here. It only knows how to do what you tell it to do. And if you forget to put it in those parentheses or something, it's going to assume that you did it right. And it's going to tell you something other than what you really wanted to get out of it. All right, so now having seen that, we now are going to do the same thing with each of the others. So next up is -4 squared, which is -4 times -4. And a negative times a negative is still a positive. And so it's going to be a positive 16. And then I can keep going through. So -3 squared would then be 9. -2 squared would be 4. -1 squared would be 1. 0 squared. Well, that would be 0 times 0, which is 0. And then we get into the positives, which actually are going to be even easier than the negatives were. So 1 squared, that's 1 times 1, is 1. And then 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, and 5 squared. And then that table would be complete. And I do have one last problem for us to be able to take a look at here together. This one is 2 to the power of x. And this one can sometimes be tricky for people to figure out. Oftentimes it's a time when we have to start breaking out the calculator. And so I want to make sure that we know how we can do it. But the good news is that kind of like the other ones, once you can do it with one of the values, you're going to be able to do it with all the other ones. And so we're going to start by doing this calculation with the -2. So we're going to be doing x equals -2, which means we have to do 2 to the power of -2. And again, notice I'm putting in parentheses just to keep it safe, to make sure that I'm clear that the negative is inside the exponent there. All right, now this is not something you probably know off the top of your head. You will eventually, and we'll talk about negative exponent rules at a later time and all that stuff. But for now, you're probably going to just need to break out your calculator. And so you're going to then take out your calculator and you're going to type in 2 to the power of -2. And it's going to be giving you a decimal. And that's actually a good thing. I want the decimal and not the fraction in this case. Later on, we're going to start delving into the fractions and seeing why they work as fractions. But for now, just stick with the decimal just for consistency. And so when you do that, it's going to give you an answer of 0.25 when you do that calculation. Which means then that our answer over here, our y value, is 0.25. We then are going to repeat that same process with our other x values. So for the next one, I would do 2 to the power of -1, which is going to be 0.5. And then I do 2 to the power of 0. A lot of people assume that that's going to be 0, but it's actually not. Anything to the power of 0 is actually 1. Check it on your calculator and you'll see 2 to the power of 0 is 1. Then after that, 2 to the power of 1, you probably don't need your calculator for this one because that just means 2. And so 2 to the power of 1 is 2. And then the next up is 2 to the power of 2, which, of course, 2 to the power of 2 is 2 squared, which, of course, is 4, because it just means 2 times 2. And then next up, we're going to do 2 to the power of 3. So 2 cubed is going to be 8. In other words, 2 times 2 times 2. 3 of them multiplied together. And then we can just keep doing that calculation. And if we keep doing that calculation, we end up with all of these values. Now, one of the questions that people often ask is, wait, why is 2 to the power of -2 going to give me 0.25? And our table here actually provides you with a way that you might be able to see that. Because you'll notice that as I went from 1 up to 2 to 4 to 8 and so on, that as I'm going down this list, I'm doubling my last value. That's what the 2 to the power of whatever it is doing. It's meaning that we're having to multiply it by one more 2. Well, if that's the case, then if I go the opposite direction, and if I'm going from bottom to top, then that would mean I would have to be dividing each of these by 2 in order to be able to get the next value. And so once I know, for instance, why I end up getting 2 here, 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 divided by 2 is 0.5. 0.5 divided by 2 is 0.25, and so on. And so that's actually kind of why it does start making sense. But again, I don't expect you to have that totally down quite yet, but I want you to start seeing it and getting used to that idea because it's going to be a bigger theme later on.